Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Totally Well Show. I'm your host, Joyce Strong. The Totally Well Show is a place where we get curious, ask questions, and explore everything to do with health, wellness, fitness, personal development, helping people, and all the things it takes to help you live a strong, joyous life. I am so excited today because I just got to interview Austin Perlmutter, MD. He is the co-author of the New York Times bestseller, Brainwash. He co-authored this book with his dad, David Perlmutter, who I've been following for years, and it turns out so hasn't Austin. He is amazing. He is the doctor of my dreams. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Perlmutter. Dr. Austin Perlmutter. He is a board-certified internal medicine physician. He received his medical degree from the University of Miami and completed his internal medicine residency at Oregon Health and Science University in Portland, Oregon. His academic focus is in understanding the decision-making process, how it is influenced by internal and external factors, and how it changes our health and illness outcomes. He is also interested in methods of improving burnout in poor mental health in the medical field. He writes for Psychology Today on his blog, The Modern Brain. So basically, you know what to do, you just don't do it. You've all said that, right? And this is the missing link. This is the part of the puzzle that we have not addressed because we are taking it from shelf help to self-help. So those books that sit on your shelf that you don't do anything with, including this one, if you don't listen to it, it's going to sit there. You're not going to reap the benefits of it, and it starts here in the brain. So I am so excited for you to listen to this episode with Dr. Austin Perlmutter, and a big shout out to Dr. David Perlmutter for doing a great job as a dad. What a kid. And any questions, reach out to Austin Perlmutter on Instagram, on their website. Go to the brainwashbook.com for to connect with either of the Dr. Perlmutters, and reach out to us. Reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn a lot. That's my fave, but you can get me on all social media platforms, even TikTok. Who knew? But find me. I'm not too hard to find because I am here to help you learn to live a strong, joyous life. So enjoy Totally Well. And with that, let me know if you have any questions. Love to see you. Love to coach you. Hi, welcome, Austin, to the Totally Well Show. I'm so excited to have you here to share your knowledge with me and to talk about your new book, New York Times bestseller, Brainwash.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here and to be talking about these really important points.
So as we talked in the preamble before, I've been following your dad, David Perlmutter, for years, and he's been a pioneer in what I call the real medicine or healthcare system. And I think of you and your dad as the true game changers, hashtag game changers. You are changing the game because you're helping us prevent. So I wanted to get into what got you behind this next book and the Brain series that your dad started, and now you've joined in forces with him.
Sure. Well, like you, I've been following my dad for some time, you might say for my whole life. And he has certainly done so much in the realm of these nutritional lifestyle interventions and making those available to people across the world. And in Grain Brain, he talked about lower carbohydrates and potential role of gluten in causing problems in people's health. And then he took that in Brain Maker to really look at the gut and how the integrity of the gut lining can be looked at as a major factor in determining the outcomes of so many health conditions. And while he was doing all this, I was doing my medical training, doing medical school, and then my internal medicine residency. And as I was finishing up my medical training, I was in these conversations with my father about what is going wrong? Because something that was incredibly pervasive for me during my clinical experience is that here you have these patients coming into the clinic and they have these problems that you and I know are preventable issues, and that may be diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, even to some extent dementia. And, we've got these wonderful strategies that my dad's outlined in his previous books that can help people get back on track. And especially as it relates to the early stages of these conditions, the pre-diabetes, the pre-hypertension, there's so much we can do to stop the process in its tracks. So I'd be sitting there with my clinic patients who are coming in and saying, hey, doc, I think I'm a bit overweight, or my blood pressure might be a bit high. And I'd say, you're absolutely right. And here's what you need to do to reverse the process, whether that's eating less refined carbohydrates, getting out and exercising a little bit, or doing some stress reduction. The patient would kind of be on board. They would say, that sounds good. I hear what you're saying. And then we'd go our separate ways. And the patient would come back a few months later and we'd check all the metrics again. We'd check the weight, the blood pressure. We'd check their levels of stress, having a conversation to ask how life was going. And nothing was different. And, here I thought I'd outlined all of the things they need to do. And the patient said, I agree, that's what I want to do. And yet we weren't getting anywhere. So having conversations about this with my father, who had experienced this in his clinical practice too, we started asking, well, what are we missing here? What are we doing wrong as it relates to patient care so that they're not basically following through on the plan? And we began to dissect how exactly it is that people make these decisions in the first place. And so kind of the model we developed for our understanding of this is you've got the information on the one end, and that's a healthy diet, that's exercising, that's spending time with people we care about. We know those are the things that lead to the things that we want in life, being a healthier person, being a happier person. And so again, we've given people the information. We know how that leads to outcomes, but the action in between, it falls apart. And so we wanted to know, what is the failure there between the information and the action? And first of all, we looked at what is it that we're doing in the standard care, and that is, if patients don't follow through on that information, we're blaming them and we're calling it a lack of willpower. And this is kind of the standard paradigm where, as a provider, if the patient doesn't follow through, we say, oh, well, either you didn't understand the information or you just didn't have the willpower. That hasn't worked, right? Patients still aren't following through, and it blames the patient for not being good enough to have that willpower. So we wanted to say, what was upstream of all of this? What kind of determines the decision-making process? And surprise, surprise, it's the brain. The way that the brain is set up is the way that you're going to make decisions. So if your brain is set up for good decisions, you're going to make good decisions. If your brain is set up for poor decisions, you're going to make poor decisions. You're not going to follow through on reaching those outcomes you care about. And then even more exciting than just this basic conversation is, you can, based on your lifestyle changes, change the wiring of your brain. You can set up your brain so it either makes good decisions, or you can, in essence, allow your brain to be wired by the modern world, by our diets, by our hyper exposure to stressful digital media, by our sedentary lifestyles, for poor decisions. So it kind of led to this paradigm, which is either you take your brain back for good decisions, or you allow other people to wire your brain for poor decisions. And again, such an incredibly important message for people to understand, which is, you don't need to be locked into this paradigm of constantly failing with trying to make lifestyle changes. That's just not helpful, because it's a self-blame paradigm. And you can get upstream of that by fixing your brain so that those good decisions come more easily. Mm-hmm. So kind of a longer explanation, but it's maybe a little bit hard for people to get their head around this whole concept. But once it clicks, once you understand that you can start taking back your brain for good decisions, the possibilities are really limitless.
I love that term, taking back, and having that, knowing that you have the control. And what I've seen after doing this work for a long time now is that coaching for compliance doesn't work.
Mm.
It just keeps people, it actually exacerbates the problem, right? It makes it worse because people don't feel good about themselves, and they're in that judgy part of their brain.
Yeah, yeah, you bring up such a good point, and that is these non-adherence or non-compliance rates. And depending on what source you look at, those are around 50%. And that means 50% of the time, the patient doesn't do what the provider tells them to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that rate can be, as you would expect, a whole lot higher when it comes to things like maintaining lifestyle interventions.
Mm-hmm.
Turns out it's pretty hard to stick to a good diet. And yet, when people don't do it, we think that's kind of your fault, your failure. And what happens when you're the patient and the provider tells you you're really messing this up is you get stressed, you activate the parts of your brain that make it more likely for you to not follow through. So you get stuck in this cycle. And again, this is the standard paradigm is, as a provider, if I give the patient the information, I've done my job. And if the patient doesn't follow through, I write non-compliant in the chart. And so it exonerates me. But at the end of the day, if the patient isn't getting better, you got to look at, is this working out? And it's not working out. So that's why it's so important to ask these questions of what's going wrong with this? Why is information not enough? And one of the main reasons that information is not enough is that so many aspects of the modern world bias our brains to make us less likely to follow through on good thinking. It's nice to think that you can tell somebody don't eat junk food and that somehow will make them not eat junk food. But you go out into the world, you're going to be exposed to advertisements for these toxic products day in and day out. You go to the grocery store and you find that 68% of the 1.2 million foods they looked at in grocery stores, food and drink, contains added sugar. So these are hacks into your brain that activate those reward centers that keep you making poor decisions. And then to just tell somebody, well, just don't eat or drink those things, you've ignored the reality of the situation, which is, for the most part, when a patient is out there in the world, they are being bombarded with these brain-altering messages that set them up for failure. And yet we don't talk about that. We just kind of say, it's up to you, take control over the situation. It's really not fair.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So we have a lot of smart listeners out there, and you mentioned a little bit about the set your brain up and being the right part of your brain. Can we talk a little bit about what the parts of the brain are we're talking about? And
absolutely. And I will say, as a general disclaimer, anything that gets into parts of the brain can be incredibly complicated.
mm-hmm.
In Brainwash, we wanted to try to simplify it as much as possible without losing the real meat of it. And so we talk about a couple of core regions of the brain. The most important thing to know about is that your reflective, thought out decisions come from a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And that's, in essence, the most recently evolved part of the brain. It is bigger in humans relative to our size than really any other animal on Earth. And it's where we think we get our powers of being able to, again, weigh the pros and cons and think about the future. Mm-hmm. So that's the prefrontal cortex. It's located right behind the forehead here. Mm-hmm. And we have seen in so many studies that your ability to kind of be a compassionate and adult, I should say, be a compassionate adult, meaning to not be driven by impulse, is a function of that prefrontal cortex. Really key that you have that online for most of your major decisions. And then we talk about these other parts of the brain that, while really key parts in maintaining homeostasis, can be kind of hacked in such a way that they create problems in your life. And so we talk about a part of the limbic system called the amygdala, which people may have heard of as kind of the fear center of the brain. In reality, it does a whole lot more than just manage fear. It's an emotion hub. It's involved with memory formation. It's also involved with the decision-making process. Mm-hmm. But for all intents and purposes, this part of the brain is designed to initiate this fight or flight fear stress response, which in days gone by was essential, because here you are out in the middle of the savannah and you are worried about a predator sneaking up from behind you. You need to know that if you hear a rustle in the leaves, what to do next. And so the amygdala says, okay, we're not going to sit here and think about it. We're going to get out of here, or we're going to turn around and attack this animal. In the modern day, though, we don't really need that as much anymore. And when the amygdala is constantly activated by such things as exposure to stressful news, it leads us to not be able to access that higher level thinking and constantly worried about our survival. So that's a problem. The other part of the brain that we talk about in the book is the reward system. And the reward system it's not a localized piece. It activates parts of the brain like the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, but it's strongly involved with this dopamine system, this dopamine circuit. And we mentioned this in our book, but important to understand that it's not so simple as saying dopamine is the reward chemical that causes pleasure, therefore we want to have low dopamine. But what we do know is that the dopamine reward system is hyperactivated in certain parts of, or certain states in the modern world. So that would mean things like eating unhealthy junk foods, things that are high in sugar, refined carbohydrates. That would mean things like going on social media for too long. Mm-hmm. And why that's a problem is when the reward system is overactivated in this way, it makes it harder for us to enjoy the little things in life. And it makes it much more likely that we're going to constantly open and scroll through our social media accounts or constantly be craving that next bite of whatever unhealthy food is in the store. So when that reward system is overactivated in the modern world, it puts us into these loops of these more or less unhealthy behaviors that even if they're not the end of, or they're not the worst thing in the world, it takes us away from the more meaningful stuff that leads to long-term health and to long-term happiness. So again, three major things we talk about in the book. One is the prefrontal cortex, which is the frontmost part of your brain, absolutely essential in allowing you to make good decisions, to reach the things that you care about in life, and to have these compassionate interactions with other people. The amygdala, which is this emotional hub that can be hijacked, leading to you constantly reacting from a place of fight or flight and not seeing the bigger picture. And then the reward system, which similarly can be amped up and kind of hijacked by the modern world, keeping you hooked on these things that really aren't good for your long-term health.
So I like to think of things in a practical way, and I know you do too, because you're so good at explaining these things to make it just make sense. If I'm working, somebody comes to me, Coach Joyce, I'm an RN, I'm a nutrition coach, and they would say, I want to lose weight. Tell me what to eat. My first thought now, after reading your book and hearing this, is to understand more about, because they know what to eat already.
Right.
And so my first thought is to find out what's going on in their life and the different challenges or obstacles that are coming up, so I can get a clue to where to intervene.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And, looking at all these diets, whether it's keto or paleo or vegan or primarily pescatarian, Mediterranean diets, they all kind of work, right? As long as you're cutting out the ultra processed food, the junk foods, you're going to do better. But the biggest reason that diets don't work isn't because their macro content is slightly different. It's because people don't stick to them. Yeah. They do the diet for a couple of months, they lose the weight, and then they slip back into their old routines. Mm-hmm. So we've got to ask this question, not so much of should my carb content be 10%, but why aren't we able to stick to the diet in the first place? Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what you're bringing up, which is, what is the soil? What does the soil look like in which we're trying to plant these crops, right? We want to have a long-term sustainable diet. We want to plant that into our brain in such a way that it takes hold and takes root, but we need to not ignore the soil, and that is the brain. And how do you set that up so it's going to provide the nutrients for that crop to grow? And so as you mentioned, looking at the aspects of their life that might be barriers, whether that's a source of significant stress, because we know that stress is going to make it harder for us to make good decisions. So acknowledging that first, whether it's problems with them being very sedentary, maybe it's moving around a little bit to activate that BDNF and therefore to foster neuroplasticity and allow their new neural networks to take hold when they're making these dietary changes. So definitely agree with that as the first step. I would say too, when it comes to the dietary recommendations that we include in Brainwash, again, everyone has his or her own dietary plan these days, and it's a slight tweak on keto maybe, or a slight tweak on paleo, or the Mediterranean diet plus, and that's all wonderful. But when we're talking about what diet we recommend, we're recommending a diet that will improve decision making to allow the person to stick to whatever plan it is that they want for the long run. Mm-hmm. And that's why we focus on lowering inflammation. And so something that was really an amazing discovery for this book is that, sure, we know that inflammation is bad for the body. And most of your listeners will probably understand that we look at diseases like heart disease, we look at diseases like diabetes, autoimmune conditions, cancers as having an inflammatory component. Chronic inflammation in the body is associated with these diseases. But what we're now putting together is that inflammation affects the wiring of the brain. And so putting this into context, chronic inflammation is linked to Alzheimer's disease. That may not be news.
Can I jump in just?
Sure.
Many of my patients have asked me, what is this inflammation? Can you like just define that? Because that's what we do. We use these words all the time, and then we think everybody understands it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So everyone's probably hearing about inflammation. And I would say that inflammation in its traditional context is what you would see, let's say, if you were bitten by a bug, or if you cut yourself, you'd see redness, you'd see swelling, you'd see warmth, you'd have pain. These are the traditional attributes of acute inflammation. Mm-hmm. It's your body sending an inflammatory response or an immune activation to a localized part of the body to kind of fight off this threat. Mm-hmm. So that is acute inflammation. And it's something that, for the most part, we need to have in our body so that we can fend off these insults, let's say, to cuts in our skin. Mm-hmm. But where we develop a problem is in chronic inflammation. So that's a different beast altogether. When we're talking about chronic inflammation, that may not be something that is visible from the outside. Again, it's not like just having a bug bite that you can point to and say, I was stung and now there's this redness. It's talking about a chronic activation of the body's immune cells in such a way that it's really not fixing much of anything, but it's just always on alert. Mm-hmm. And so we see that this can actually be caused by a condition of chronic stress, which is literally that high alert state that over time is telling the body we need to be ready for something. That is damaging to the body, because when those immune cells are chronically activated, it doesn't allow multiple systems in our body to function the way that they are supposed to. And so that leads to things like endothelial or blood vessel dysfunction, which is why we think that chronic stress is so closely linked to conditions like heart disease. So again, to try to clearly distinguish this again, you've got acute inflammation. That's where you have this redness and swelling, and that can very well be a good thing to allow you to manage something that, again, like a bug bite. But where inflammation becomes chronic, which is something that we see a lot more in the modern world, that's where you start having higher risk of conditions like heart disease, like dementia, like diabetes, like autoimmune conditions, like cancer. Mm-hmm. So I hope that clears things up a little bit.
That's very helpful, yeah. Because I feel like people, when they have this chronic stress or no sleep or eating processed food, that they actually have something similar to trauma, like as if you had a traumatic brain injury. You have trauma to your system, but you didn't get a cut, you didn't get hit with something. Is that incorrect?
I think that's fair. I think it's fair to say what happens when you have chronic inflammation in the body is in essence, your body is undergoing chronic trauma, right? It is undergoing these immune effects that lead to damage to cells across the spectrum of your body. And one of the things that this inflammation does too is it damages the brain. It changes the cells in the brain in a negative way. We've seen that things like chronic stress and inflammation are linked to diseases like Alzheimer's disease, which is characterized by a atrophy of neurons, specifically in the hippocampus, the memory center of the brain. So very much these things, like you said, not getting enough sleep, eating a pro-inflammatory standard American diet, and being exposed to chronic stress that's so prevalent in the modern day, those things ramp up inflammation, chronic inflammation in the body, and that chronic inflammation in the body is absolutely toxic in the long run.
Can you talk to me about what foods, for example, may be pro-inflammatory? Because oftentimes people come and I'll say, well, the good news is you're going to get everything you want. You're going to be really healthy. The challenge is I want to take some of these things out.
Yeah.
I don't want to be that person to be taking something away from, I want it to make sense for people so they choose that this is good for me, this is not good for me. So what are the pro-inflammatory culprits?
Well, I'll just say as a general point, people always want to just add something in, whether that's an anti-inflammatory food like turmeric, right? Adding some spice.
Oh yeah, people are like, what supplement should I take? And let's
Yeah.
not talk about supplements, or let's talk about
Yeah.
the fat.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, you want to go out and have your drink all the alcohol and eat all the junk food and then wake up the next day and pop a supplement and everything is okay. It just doesn't work that way. So to understand that certain foods, certain drinks are strongly pro-inflammatory is important, because then you can ideally cut those out of your diet as much as possible. And then at the same time, adding in foods that have been shown to have an anti-inflammatory effect. Okay. I think you can get really lost in the weeds for these things. And by you, I don't mean you, I mean people can get really caught up in the specifics of here's how much of this vegetable I need to activate this pathway. And that's great if that's where you're at, but a lot of people aren't there. And so what I would say to people is, here are the things you really need to avoid. Ultra processed food. That's just my general blanket term for anything that people have messed with a lot. And so to kind of go through the macronutrients as far as what that might mean, the best example of ultra processed food is most carbohydrates that you find out in the grocery store, the things you find around the periphery of the grocery store. If you can't label that as something you recognize, if it has a bunch of ingredients on the back of it that you don't know about, that is an ultra processed food. Mm-hmm. And so looking at things like muffins and danishes and kind of your refined carbohydrates, cookies and chips, those are ultra processed carbohydrates that they've had all of the healthy fiber stripped away. And those are things that create inflammation in the body. So looking out for processed or refined carbohydrates is the best thing to do when it comes to the carbohydrate macro. The other thing in the carbohydrate macro is the sugars. It's the added sweeteners. I mean, these are the things where they've literally taken away anything that benefits you. And so you're left with this additive, which, as I said, sugar is added to most of our most of our foods and our drinks. Mm-hmm. And sugar leads to inflammation in the body. It leads to chronic inflammation in the body. So looking out for situations where there are added sweeteners in your food and drink. And that means reading the back of your nutrition facts and saying, okay, is there sugar in this? And where is that sugar coming from? Mm-hmm. Something where, unless you're aware of it, you're not going to know, because most foods, the default is that foods and drinks contain added sweetener. Mm-hmm. So again, in the carbohydrate macro, you want to think about, is this a refined carbohydrate where the healthiness of it has been stripped away? Mm-hmm. And is this something that contains an added sweetener? Now, moving on to the fats. Now, as I'm sure, listeners are aware, we've had this demonization we've demonized fats for a while, unnecessarily so, because they tend to actually be really necessary for proper function of your body and of your brain. Mm-hmm. But it's important with fats to know, what are your fat sources? Mm-hmm. So again, the ultra processed fats are the ones to avoid. And those are fats that have been heavily processed by things like expeller practicing. So you want to look at vegetable fats that tend not to be found in vegetables, things like soybean oil, things like canola oil. These tend to be the types of fats that create inflammation in the body. And in general, as most people are aware, trans fats are really something that you need to look out for because they have been linked with pretty clearly a variety of negative health consequences.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to fats, you might be better served trying to make sure that it falls within certain categories, and that is primarily mono and polyunsaturated fats, in addition to certain types of saturated fats. And we'll talk about those specifically when we go into what are those anti-inflammatory foods you want to bring into your diet. But when it comes to fats, your goal is to say, is this something that humans have messed with a bunch? Meaning, has it needed a whole bunch of processing to get it from the seed or the vegetable to this bottle that I now have on my shelf?
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, when it comes to proteins, I think maybe one of the more interesting things that we were looking into for the book is the whole conversation about proteins. And to kind of simplify what can be a rather nuanced subject, I would say, again, if humans have messed with that protein a lot, if it's ultra processed, then it's probably not something that you should be eating. And that goes for both the vegetable and animal-based protein sources. So if you're looking at this vegetable-based protein that has a whole bunch of different additives to it, and it's trying to substitute for a meat, probably not your best bet. Similarly, if you're finding that your protein sources are coming from animals that have been raised in yards where they're fed unnatural foods, and where they've, in essence, had a life where they've been exposed to hormones, antibiotics, you're eating that when you're eating the animal. So that is an ultra processed animal source of protein, which again is concerning because it leads to inflammation. So I hope that's helpful. You know, it's really hard to describe what are the anti and pro-inflammatory foods without going into too much depth on each individual one. But as a general blanket statement, I say, if you can look at a food and say, this is something that people haven't messed with too much, that's going to be a lot better for you than something where you're kind of unsure as to what exactly that food is, where it's coming from, how many extra ingredients have gone into it, and, you know, uncertain quality as it relates to animal protein specifically.
Mm-hmm. And just on that last point about the animal. So for example, if you're eating an animal that's been fed corn or been fed grains, as opposed to grass-fed or free range, then
Right.
you're actually, that it would be an argument for getting the organic or the free range, or paying a little bit extra for that quality.
Yeah, when you're eating an animal, you're also eating what that animal ate. And so if that animal was fed junk, then, you know, it's like you're eating all that junk too. That's what defines the animal meat. I would say in general, as it relates to inflammation, beyond just trying to make sure that your animal proteins come from, if possible, free range, organic, and wild sources, we are learning that one of the things that the amino acid profile of animals tends to do is activate certain pathways that are associated with inflammation at higher levels. And so looking at your protein content, specifically by age range, if you're a younger person, chances are you're getting more protein than you need from animal sources. And that may not be necessary. So something we talk about in the book is, for most people, probably turning down the amount of protein that you get from animal sources, because a lot of studies have looked at the quality of, well, the outcomes associated with either plant-based or animal-based sources, and find that in general, inflammation and several outcomes tends to be better when people are consuming more protein from plant-based sources. Now, that certainly isn't telling people you can't eat animal protein. We're trying to make general recommendations, and the general recommendation is that for most people, if you're eating animal protein in the United States, it's probably not going to be of a very high quality, and you're better off primarily doing more of the plants because those you can vouch for a bit more. And also, you're probably eating more protein from animal-based sources than you need. So definitely something to look at. And we're certainly not telling people that you need to cut out things like wild salmon, some occasional grass-fed, free-range animal protein. It's just, we've got to be conscious of what we're doing in the quantities that we're doing it. And again, Americans just have for many reasons, a strong desire to eat a whole lot of animals.
Now you mentioned something about age. So what about I'm 66. What about an older person? Is it the same, or you mentioned younger, or does it?
Yeah, so this is primarily based on Walter Longo's research out of California. And so what he looks at is the protein intake and marker called IGF-1, or insulin-like growth factor 1. And what he's shown in his research is that when you're younger, higher levels of this IGF-1 are associated with worse outcomes. When you're older, you may actually want a little bit more protein on board, a little bit higher levels of this, because it seems to maintain muscle mass. It seems to maintain strength. And what this is talking about really is this kind of popular topic right now, which is the mTOR pathway, which, again, can get lost in this for a while. But the basic idea is your body is either in a state of building or it's in a state of breaking down. And when it's in a state of breaking down, it's also in a state of cleaning things out and making sure everything is functioning really well. And so you want to have a balance of those two pathways, the anabolic and the catabolic pathway. And when you are eating a lot of extra meat, of extra protein, that is activating the anabolic buildup pathway.
Mm-hmm.
And so over time, that seems to be associated with worse health outcomes if it's done without the balance part of it. And so what Walter Longo has shown is that after a certain age, so once you get into your 60s, 70s, it's probably practical to add in more protein intake and then to use that as a way of strengthening your body and adding more to that anabolic pathway. So I can certainly send you the article, but he has more specific recommendations as to the actual amount of protein he recommends in grams per kilogram per a person, depending on their age. And it may be a little bit too technical for everyone to be able to incorporate. It may not be necessary for everyone to incorporate that, but I think it is good to get a ballpark idea of the fact that if you're a younger person, you probably don't need as much protein as you thought. We're moving away from this mentality that I certainly had when I was younger, which is if you're a young guy, you need to be loading up with as much protein as you can so you get bulked up and so you're strong, and that you can eat as much protein as you want because that's not a problem. Turns out that protein still is involved in these insulin signaling pathways and these inflammatory pathways a whole lot more than I had originally thought, and it's not just about carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm. So I had a question I was going to ask you there. That made me think a little bit about the reason why we talk about time-restricted feeding and intermittent fasting.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of that ties in quite closely. The idea, again, is your body needs a break so that it can clean stuff out. And so there's a lot of conversation right now around intermittent fasting, time-restricted eating, but really just creating these cleaning windows. I think it makes a lot of sense. I always try to go back to our genes are adapted for a specific type of life. And I can't imagine that for the majority of humans' time on Earth, we were snacking all day and all night. I can't imagine that our ancestors were waking up at 10 p.m. and going out to whatever the equivalent of a kitchen was and having one more bite of mastodon. That just wasn't happening. So everything's got to be in balance. And I think it makes a lot of sense for the average person to at least institute a 12-hour window where they're not taking in nutrition at the end of the day, or potentially expanding that to 14 or even 16 hours and seeing how you feel. This is something that a lot of health people have started to recommend, and it makes sense from a biochemical level. And I think from just the way that you'll feel, you will actually feel better. Not to mention, you're going to have more time available to do other things when you're not constantly thinking, hey, it's 11 o'clock. I was going to go to sleep, but let me just go have one more bite of that Chinese food in the fridge. Yeah. So I think that the time restricted eating has become very popular. The intermittent fasting, additionally, which is kind of just an extended version of the same thing, makes a lot of sense. And then if you're capable of it, I did a few day fast a couple of months ago, and it's not necessarily the most enjoyable thing right off the bat, but it's good to do that for your body. And I think it's good to do it for your brain. I mean, there's a lot of philosophy around the idea of depriving yourself of something for a little bit so that you recognize it's not the end of the world. And so you more appreciate these things when you do have them. So I'm a big fan of the fasting in general.
And is that term autophagy come into play here? Is that?
Yeah. So autophagy basically just means that a cell is capable of kind of recycling, breaking down parts of it that don't necessarily work. And autophagy is activated by fasting, which is why it's been so popular in recent years, is that you can activate autophagy by getting off of nutrition for a little bit. That's, again, talking about this mTOR pathway and the idea that you want to activate autophagy. That is a cleaning mechanism that allows you to get rid of cellular processes that aren't working out for you. So it's like kind of like if you're the boss of a company, that's the review, right, in the middle of the year, where you look at all your employees and say, hey, who is actually benefiting the company right now and who is not? And then, you make room for new employees to come in and keep things moving at a good clip, basically adapting to your environment so that you are making a company that continues to be on the cutting edge of whatever it is you're doing. But you can't do that if you're constantly eating a whole bunch of nutrients. So again, I need to be snacking every 2.5 hours, or I can't go more than a few hours without eating. Otherwise, my blood sugar gets low. I mean, there are some conditions in which that may be the case. And we're not talking about people here with diabetes who are on a schedule with their insulin and their carb intake. What we're talking about is, I've heard so many people tell me, oh, well, I need to be eating every couple of hours. Otherwise, I feel crummy. Yeah, you do feel crummy, but the reason for it is because, yes, your blood sugar is going down, your insulin is up and dropping your blood sugar because you're eating these meals that cause these erratic spikes in your blood sugar. And so, as long as you stay in that cycle of consistently putting in these rapidly absorbed carbohydrates, you are going to be constantly craving that meal every couple of hours. And so switching more over to a metabolism based on fat, protein, and getting rid of those refined carbohydrates, replacing them with complex carbohydrates, and then adding in some of these windows of not eating, your hormonal regulation of hunger is going to change completely. And that's going to allow you not to feel so hungry all the time. It's going to allow you to reclaim some autonomy over your day, where you're not the slave to your cravings and you're able to actually get work done or go to sleep at a reasonable hour and not be pulled out for the midnight snack.
And think better.
That is kind of the bottom line here, is the thinking piece, right? And we've talked about a bunch of things, and I would definitely say that if there's a take-home message from this book, Brainwash, it's that you've got to start with working on your brain, because all of the other stuff, you want to do time-restricted eating, fantastic. You want to cut carbohydrates out of your diet, fantastic. Look, all of those things are wonderful. I'm actually in my dad's office right now. These are not my books, but you can see there are a whole bunch of books on this back wall, and they are filled with great information. Yeah. I've read a lot of them. You go through, you say, yes, this makes sense. This is a great thing. But that doesn't matter. You can have all the books in the world unless your brain is set up for you to follow through on that information. Yeah. And that's why I think it's so critical that we take that step back and say, why are we not following through? It's not that we don't know the information. It's that the brain can't absorb it. And I wrote a piece recently for Psychology Today where I was talking about how these New Year's resolutions we have don't stick. We come up with, I'm going to exercise for 30 minutes a day. I'm going to stop eating anything with added sugar. I'm going to call my long lost cousin that I've been meaning to catch up with for the last 3.5 years. The issue with it is that your brain isn't on your team. Yeah. Because you say, I want to start this new diet. Your brain says, yeah, we're going to eat the potato chips. You can say whatever you want, right? You can tell everyone that you're doing the new diet, but when it comes 4 p.m., I'm still going to want that soda and to sit on the couch and watch the TV show. So we've got to get our brain on our team, because bottom line is, you can tell anyone you want about how healthy you're going to become. If you don't act on it, it's kind of worthless. And it's even worse than worthless, because then when you don't do it, you're just going to feel worse about yourself. Right. And then you're going to be less likely to make it happen.
Yeah, you stay in that vicious cycle.
Yeah.
There's a a local hospital here. I'm in the Boston area, so
Yeah.
in local hospital, there's a wellness clinic, and they have all these classes, and I'm teaching a bunch of them. And I look at all these exercise classes, and I thought, I'm going to do a class on transitioning back to health and wellness over 60. And my thinking was in line with, I'm not going to show them how to do exercises, because I think they can look at any of those shelf help books
Yeah.
and figure that out. But this is exactly what I want to say is, you know what to do. Why aren't you doing it? And that missing puzzle piece.
I would say, unless somebody is interested in this, you can't really do much, right? If I was to tell somebody, hey, you need to change your brain, you need to start making these positive changes in your life, and they say, I'm not interested, everything is great. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of play there to start making changes. And so one of the things that we've really looked at is, how do you convey the message of this in such a way that there are a lot of ways a person can make that personally meaningful. So that's why we say it may not be about wanting to lose the weight. It may not be about wanting to lower your blood sugar. It may not be about wanting to spend more time with your friends and family. It may not be about wanting to do better at work, but it could be any of those things. And if it is any of those things, let's say you want to get a promotion at work. Let's say you want to be more financially responsible. You want to lose some weight and feel better. You want to spend time with friends and family. Well, any of those points is a place where you can start making these changes. Mm-hmm. And then once you start making the changes, the other things will seem more important to you. So I talk about this with my patients is, you have somebody come in, you say, what you really need to do is cut back on the carbohydrates. They say, I can see that, but I don't
eat.
Right.
There's nothing to eat.
or they say, just, I don't care about that right now.
Yeah.
I would like to cut back on the carbs, but it's not my priority.
Yeah.
Instead, I want to work on something else. I just like to be less stressed.
Yeah.
And so what we talk about is, if you can find an intervention to lower stress, maybe what that is having them go out into nature for 20 minutes a day. Mm-hmm. That's a stress lowering intervention. Maybe it's meditation for 12, 20 minutes a day. That's a stress lowering intervention. When you lower the stress in that person's brain, when you lower the stress pathways, that will then make them more likely to make good choices. And so maybe a month later, they come back into the clinic and they've worked on the stress pathway. Now that lowering carbohydrate, improving dietary thing is something they can focus on, something they care about. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't make sense to force people into things they don't care about. And so the idea would be, if you can change the brain so that they become more interested in being healthy people and making good decisions, you've found a back door that will allow you to make those changes you want. So thinking about these people who are in this class at the wellness center and about the exercise thing, they're there. So maybe they have an interest in doing the exercise, but if you're able to work on other aspects of their life at the same time, that's going to feed into wanting them to continue exercising. Mm-hmm. Also, what's really fascinating is, if you can get over the hump and start exercising a little bit, that's going to activate the prefrontal cortex. That's going to make you more likely to make better decisions in other aspects of your life. Also, when it relates to inflammation, there's some recent research that shows how when you exercise, your skeletal muscle actually converts a certain enzyme, well, I should say a certain molecular pathway mm-hmm. towards a way that is less inflammatory. So it has less of this inflammation that can get into the brain. So when you're exercising, one of the core things you're doing is you're lowering inflammation, which, as we've said, is a disaster for the whole body, but also for the brain. You're activating those muscles. You're actually shunting inflammation away from your brain, which is super powerful.
That's so helpful to know. And just really focusing then with my students in this class on what's most important to you.
Yes.
And I always say, and doing the least amount you can possibly do to get started, because lowering mm-hmm. the threshold or the barrier to entry. So when you say exercise, I think move, do what you love.
Yeah. I think we health providers love to box people in and say, you need to get 30 minutes of cardiovascular exercise or aerobic exercise 5 days a week, because that's the recommendation. And if you're not doing it, there's no point. And I think that, just like meditation, it's not a helpful way of looking at it. If you're doing it at all, you're successful. So if you are to get up and walk around your block one time, you just exercised. I'm so excited for you. If you are to close your eyes for 5 minutes and try to meditate, or even 1 minute, that's phenomenal. And I'm so excited for you. But this unrealistic expectation that everyone needs to go to CrossFit for 3 hours a day, it just doesn't help, you know? Yeah. It's when you take people who aren't exercising and you say, the options are, yeah,
yeah,
yeah, you could do something or nothing. Something is so much better. And especially as it relates to the thinking process, if you can do something and activate a bit of your prefrontal cortex, if you can lower a little bit of inflammation, if you can lower a little bit of stress, that's a phenomenal thing that you've just done. Whether or not you've hit your VO2 max, that's ideal, you know?
Mm-hmm. And it's lifelong. It's lasts forever because we're going slow. We're building habits, and so.
Yeah, I think the habit conversation it's another deep conversation that is super important. But as it relates to our book, I've been talking about this on a couple of different podcasts. Habits are essential for us to follow through with good behaviors. But if you want to set up healthy habits, you need to have a brain that will enable you to do that. You've got to set the course. And that's what the prefrontal cortex does. It says, okay, I want to set a new trajectory. And that is, I want to become a healthier person by doing these things. And unless you have that online, all the habit ideas in the world aren't going to work for you. You've got to have the idea of having the new habit and having a good idea of what that habit's going to look like before anything's going to happen for you.
And be in the right part of your brain to make that decision at the time, and as opposed to fear-based, or impulse-based.
Yeah, which is unfortunately where a lot of Americans are spending their day. It's going from one quick fix to the next. And we see that the average American is spending 4 hours a day watching TV, another 2 hours of the day interacting with screens, whether that's computer or cell phones. And I'm not saying watching TV is bad. I'm not saying being on your phone or computer is bad. Look, we're having this conversation right now through our computers. Yeah. But when you ask yourself what you're doing with your day and what are you feeling during your day, and you think about what it is that most people are getting through the TV. We talked about news and how that's so stressful and activating the amygdala. We're basically setting ourselves up for constantly being in a fight or flight situation and having our reward pathways overactivated, which keeps us from experiencing life to the fullest. It keeps us from reaching out to our neighbors and saying, hey, how are you? Do you want to get together for a cup of coffee? It keeps us from going out and going for a jog or going to the gym or spending a little extra time making a healthy meal, because you can't see the bigger picture if you're locked into this stressful us versus them tribalism mentality, or this quick fix idea. But understanding that most aspects of society are set up to foster that, because if you're a company that sells junk food, your goal is to get somebody to kind of without thinking buy that junk food. If you are a company that makes a social media advertisement or a social media company in and of itself, your goal is to get people to stick their eyes on your product and keep them there and then spend your money on it. And again, we just got to ask ourselves, where are we spending our time? We came up with this, or we developed this acronym in Brainwash, which we call the test of time. And I think it's a really helpful way of approaching specifically our digital interactions, which threaten to pull us away from good thinking and to take us away from more meaningful pursuits. So it's time. T, do a time restriction on your digital exposure, whether that means setting a timer for 30 minutes or what I've been trying to do, which is 5 minutes a day for social media. I is intentional, meaning if you're going to watch TV, again, that's fine, but be intentional about what you're trying to do. Don't just turn on the TV for the sake of having the TV on and flip through the stations. Have a goal. And then M is mindful, and that means being aware of how it's affecting you. So if you turn on the TV, you're watching this news, the news is saying the world is ending, you're feeling those building sensations of stress coming through your body, you're feeling your heart rate going up. Be aware of that. And then maybe if you are aware of it, say, hey, do I still need to be watching TV? Is it worth it for this? And then the E is for enriching. is it actually improving my quality of life? I think this maybe is the most important point, and that is to say after you've, let's say, gone online and spent 20 minutes watching YouTube or on Instagram or watching TV, take a pause and say, did that actually benefit me? Did I come away with a net benefit? Or am I now feeling stressed and like I wasted time, or even a little bit depressed, which is actually the way a lot of people feel when they watch a bunch of TV.
Mhm.
And if the answer to that question is no, if you don't feel like you came away with a net benefit, that's the time to pause and to say, how do I now structure my next interaction with digital technology so that it benefits me, so that I'm not losing my time, losing potentially my money, if you're getting sucked into these TV ads or computer ads to buying products you don't need, but missing out on the other things in life that we know are linked to better happiness in the long run. So again, it's the
Like
time tool or the test of time.
Yeah, that's a wonderful tool, and I'm definitely going to share that. But the better things, meaning things like being in touch with nature or connecting with loved
Yeah.
ones, those kinds of things.
Yeah. I think that, a lot of the stuff we include in the book isn't new. We definitely didn't invent nature, and we certainly didn't come up with meditation as a strategy.
Yeah.
What we're talking about now, though, is the research showing why these things work, and specifically how you can harness the best versions of these things to live within the modern world and still be successful. So we don't tell people they need to move to an ashram and spend the next 3 years in a silent retreat. We similarly don't tell people they need to move out into the middle of the woods and go off grid and never speak to somebody or use the internet again.
Mhm.
What we are talking about, though, is there is substantial research that now shows how these interventions, even at a limited level, for example, we talk about 20 minutes of nature,
Mhm.
are enough to offset some of the biggest problems that come from the modern world. So that means we know we're all experiencing high levels of chronic stress. Chronic stress is damaging your body, it's damaging your brain, it's damaging your relationships, it's lowering your quality of life.
Mhm.
We know the modern world is stressful. We're not telling you to take yourself out of that. What we are saying is there are ways to lower that chronic stress. One of the ways is through nature, which, in addition to just being a wonderful thing, has been scientifically shown to lower levels of cortisol in people who go outside, even in an urban nature environment, for 20 minutes. So we want to give people that knowledge so they can say, look, my life is stressful, my job is stressful, I'm not going to quit my job at any point in the near future, and we're not recommending that. But maybe I go outside for 20 minutes a day and help offset that. And it doesn't even have to be that complicated. You can actually benefit from putting a plant in your office or in your home, and you can even benefit from putting a picture of a plant in your office or in your home.
Yeah.
So again, ancient wisdom, we know nature is good for us, but now modern understanding of why and how to take advantage of it so that you can best live in the modern world in a balanced way.
We recently had a snowstorm here, and I got 22,000 steps on my Fitbit, and spent the time, and I kept thinking of you, and I was like, in fact, I was listening to your book, and I was out there shoveling, and I was out there with nature, and I was like, the doctor's Perlmutter said this is good for me. I'm getting
It is good for
my
you.
BDNF. I'm out in nature, and
Yeah, and what a reframing of something too. Such an important thing, because you could go out there and feel, woe is me that I have to do this horrible thing of shoveling the snow, and I'm going to move somewhere south, and there are so many better things I could be doing with my life. Bottom line is, you're going to be out there shoveling the snow. And if you approach it from the perspective of saying, this is actually a really nice thing I'm doing for my body and for my brain, you're going to enjoy that time so much more. And we know that in general, optimism is associated with better health outcomes.
yeah.
So you think about all of the positive benefits you're getting from being positive about that. It's not just being in nature, it's not just the exercise, but developing and cultivating that sense of optimism around, this is a great thing, I'm very thankful, and having gratitude about the fact that you are in a good enough physical state that you can go out there and shovel that snow. There's so much to gain from just a simple reframing of this stuff that we kind of already all do.
Yeah, and it feeds on itself because, in fact, I did what I had to do, and the plow came, and I was like, I think I'll go down and touch that up a little bit now. I was like, I was on a roll, and I was like, where did that come from? Normally it would be, like you say, woe is me, I have to do this, and
Yeah.
now it's like, oh, great, a snow day.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I'm in Florida right now, so we don't have much snow, but I spent the last 4 years in the Pacific Northwest up in Portland, Oregon.
Yeah,
And something I talk about in the book is winters up there are, what's the word I want to use? Rainy.
yeah,
Rainy would be the word. They're super rainy. They're a little bit bleak.
yeah.
And there are kind of two ways to approach it. One is you say, I wish it was sunnier, and I'm just going to stay inside and wait until the sun comes back out. And the other way is to say, look, it's a little bit rainy, it's a little bit cold out, but this is wonderful. The trees are all having tons of beautiful moss on them. The waterfalls are all really active. And so for me, it was getting myself the first few times more forcing myself to leave my apartment and to go out into the woods, even though it was dark and gloomy out. But you get out there and you realize, look at this amazing place. And then the nature effect starts trickling in and lowering your stress level and improving your day. And so, I mean, even with the snow, you could think to yourself, how miserable that it's so snowy and I'm just going to sit inside. Or you could go outside, get a little walk in. You could appreciate the snow for what it is. And I got to say, for me, that was so significant in improving my mood over the course of the 4 years I was out there.
I love that. Ben Zander says there's no such thing as bad weather, just inappropriate clothing.
I love that. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Well, Dr. Perlmutter, you've been so generous with your time, and I could talk to you all day, but I feel that I should let you go. I want to make sure people know how to reach you for the best ways to reach you.
The best way is probably to go through the book website, which is brainwashbook.com, and there's contact information on there for both me and my dad. I also have I do have an Instagram, surprise, surprise, with the one I'm trying to do 5 minutes a day on, but if people want to reach me on there, it's Austin Perlmutter on Instagram.
Okay, great. Well, I'll include that in my show notes as well. Is there
Perfect.
anything else that I haven't asked you that you'd like to share or to sum it up?
Well, I would just want people to know that, again, you've kind of got the person that you want to be in your head, the one who exercises, the one who eats healthier, the one who calls up their parents instead of putting it off. And, again, we all know where we're trying to get to, and there's this barrier between who we are now and who we want to become. And when we don't do the things that we think we should be doing, we blame ourselves. And, it's not the best way of looking at this. And so I'd say what we're talking about in Brainwash is a new approach. And that is, if you start with your brain, if you design your brain for compassion, for happiness, but also for better decisions, then you don't have to spend all your time wishing you were doing something differently, because you're getting to the source of it. So I'd really recommend to people, if they're just going to do a couple of things, it's start prioritizing your sleep. It's an unbelievable way to start activating the prefrontal cortex and calming down the amygdala. So getting that 7 to 8 hours of sleep it's critical in enabling you to start taking control back over your decision making. We talk about a lot of other things in the book. We've talked about several of those on this podcast today, but just give yourself that first night of good sleep and see how well you feel. See how much better your thinking is. And that will start to give you insight into how much control you really do have over the wiring and the functional connections and activation patterns of your brain.
And when we talk about sleep, I just want to sneak this in. It's not sleep that's it's not real sleep if it's induced by a drug or by alcohol, or you're talking about real sleep.
Yeah. Unfortunately, for all those people who want to have a couple of glasses of wine before bed, we're talking about unaided sleep. We're talking about getting in bed without a whole bunch of sleep medications on board, or without kind of drinking the glass of wine, which sure, I've done too, but it compromises your quality of sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And what we know is that the best sleep tends to be the sleep that you get naturally.
Mm-hmm. Well, I really appreciate all your time, Dr. Perlmutter. You've been such a gift to me to in your book and all that you're doing. And I hope you teach all the doctors in the world because you're
Well, thank you so
definitely
much for having me on. I look forward to hopefully chatting again soon.
okay. Well, thank you again. Thank you very, very much.